Hello, hello, and welcome to another Pilates Hour by Polestar. Today, I'm excited to have my co-host, Shelly Power, who you have seen and heard of probably more than me, even in and around the world. So good to have you back, Shelly.
Good to be here.
We're going to talk about a very important topic today. So it's one that continues to come up. And, how many questions did we actually have come in when we put out the call for questions?
90, I think. And actually there were probably more because some were just nice people saying, hey, hi, thanks for the webinar. So more than 100 responses for sure.
Yeah. And we're over 1,200 again signed up for today. So we know it's an important topic. We know there's lots of information to cover. We certainly want to bring the latest information to you and some of the latest science that is looking at a concept that we have embraced wholly in the physical therapy, in the fitness world, and in the Pilates world that is being questioned right now in research. And we want to clarify some of the mysteries and the myths that are out there and try to bring the best science to you. And that's what we're going to do today. So again, great to have you, Shelly. If you don't know Shelly, Shelly is the Vice President of Polestar Education. We've been working together for over 30 years now, and we are celebrating our 30-year anniversary in the world for Polestar. So that's super cool. And let's jump right into talking about muscles of the core. And, it's funny, Shelly, we've gotten a little bit of a reputation of being anti-core in Polestar. And it couldn't be further from the truth, but what it really comes down to is how we teach core, how we facilitate core. What are some of the challenges that you're seeing out there, Shelly, as we get ready to talk about some muscle anatomy here? We still need muscles.
I think that is one of the things that people are like, oh, you never cue the core. And it's like, oh, hold on. I absolutely do. It's just the difference between knowing the anatomy. Like, you need to know where these muscles are. You need to know the directions they run in. You need to know pairs of muscles that act either as, antagonists or synergists. And it's important then to know how the brain is controlling these things and the nervous system. And you need to know these pieces of information. But then you need to go the next step and make sure that your cueing really is, cueing the whole system. So we're going to talk a little bit about that later. But it's very different to know the muscles and cue the muscles, because really, if I said, right now, as you're sitting there, cue, engage your whatever, I could pick any of these muscles. Some you can do volitionally, some you can't so much. And it doesn't produce anything. It's just the muscle gets tight and then it's not tight. And after that, so that's one of the things, is really how to cue it. And also people, because we've heard of these things, and so many questions came through as I was looking about navel to spine, belly button to spine, engage your abdominals, engage your stomach.
That's my
favorite. I love engaging my stomach after I've eaten.
And get that hydrochloric acid flowing to be able to break down those proteins and fatty acids.
Right. And so, it's not that any cue is particularly wrong. There are just a lot better ways to get what you're after. And that's one of the things that I'm really interested is why. And I ask this question often of my students. They'll say, maybe we're doing some work together and they'll say, oh, whoever they're teaching, Sally, engage your abdominals or pull your abdominals in. And my question always is, what did you see? What did you notice that caused you to want to cue the abdominal muscles? What did you notice that led you to say, tighten your abdominals or whatever? And so that's that's where we want to get to, is what are you seeing and noticing, and how can you make a change to that without just cueing a muscle?
Yeah. And a lot of times what I bring to the table here is looking at what is the intra-abdominal pressure required to do the activity. And I think this is where we get confused, is anybody who thinks or assumes that they can cue a muscle and have a direct correlation with the proper intra-abdominal pressure is sorely wrong. I mean, we can't do that. We haven't been able to show that. But what we can show is that we can create loads, and the loads themselves create a systemic cue for the body to organize correctly. And as we have more and more cueing and more practice, then we become more efficient in the process of motor learning and motor control. And so that's sort of where we want to go with today. I do want to re-emphasize in this lecture, in this little workshop that we put together for the webinar today, is how important the muscles are as part of having intra-abdominal pressure and core control. But I also want us to understand that it's not going to be through volitional training. So if you can respect the fact that we need to have intra-abdominal pressure control or core control, and you respect the fact that there are ways to cue it that are very effective and definitely more effective than isolated muscle contraction, then we are off to a good start in today's webinar. So let's go. If you look at this slide, I just sort of broke them down, the muscles of the trunk. And again, anybody thinking of, the two other muscles I didn't put on here that need to be talked about as well is going to be the diaphragm and the pelvic floor muscles that are the horizontal plates and diaphragms that help control the intra-abdominal pressure. But when we look at the core muscles, we have to take into account the extensors as well in the back and the spine and everything that goes around it. So I broke it up simply: vertical muscles, rectus abdominis and erector spinae. There's quite a few components to that. We're not going to go into that depth today. Oblique muscles, we talk about always internal, external obliques. We don't realize also that multifidi, interossei, psoas major, and quadratus lumborum all have diagonal and oblique characteristics as it pertains to either stiffening and preventing rotatory forces or facilitating rotatory forces, right? And then, of course, the horizontal muscle that we all talk a lot about, which is transversus abdominis. And that's the one often where when we use that cue of, draw the belly button to the spine or navel to spine, that is sort of coming from Richardson and Hodges' work, a lot of it, of trying to do an active engagement or isolation of the transversus abdominis. And the question will come back, we'll look at it, is that necessary? But let's look at some of these pictures of muscles. These are some drawings that are out of a new book. The diaphragm I have up here because I wanted us to be able to see the relation of the diaphragm. And this is looking at the diaphragm from the bottom up. So if you got your body cut in half and all the guts got pulled away, we're looking at the diaphragm from the bottom up. And I'm going to use my mouse here to help me do this. You can see my mouse. So here's the descending aorta. This is where the esophagus comes down into the stomach, which would be often this hollowing here of the diaphragm. And then this is the ascending vena cava. What I also want to bring attention to is just what we call the slips or the cruces of the diaphragm that come down and surround to make these openings that allow for these vessels to pass through safely and still have a strong attachment into the front of the spine. So that's really important there. And then the other thing to notice is that here you have muscles horizontally going through the diaphragm. This is the psoas major. And if we go back here, we can see another muscle coming through. This is the quadratus lumborum. So just a quick thing to think of, everything is integrated, everything pulls together, everything is working on a subconscious, sub-threshold organization, usually from the spinal cord itself. That was part of Hodges' work. And this was something that we misinterpreted early on, that in order for these muscles to work correctly, they're often working within 50 milliseconds of the stimulus. Well, that means it's a spinal cord reflex. It's not getting up to the brain. And so there's something that's creating a stretch reflex or a load reflex that the body then creates more tension naturally to be able to maintain the proper intra-abdominal pressure for the anticipated activity or task. And that's what we've been trying to say. I think we're getting more articulate, Shelly, about it. But this is the idea that these muscles typically are going to work on the autonomic nervous system and also are going to work in the spinal cord reflex mechanism. as it pertains to intra-abdominal pressure. So here we look at the vertical muscles, and again, just drawing, pencil drawing, depicting it. But I want you to realize that the fibers are all vertical, and they're attaching to the rib cage and to the pelvis. So they are creating a compressive force, especially when they're compared or associated with the erector spinae on the next slide. So here again, you see the verticality of the erector spinae. Again, we often break these down into 3 muscle groups. And even then you go down to smaller segmental stimulation, which would be spinal cord stimulation coming out and being able to facilitate the contraction of those local muscles as they pertain to the stretch that's coming from those same muscles. So if you think about it, we've often talked about the multifidi having like 6 times the number of muscle spindle fibers in it. And the muscle spindle fiber reflex is a spinal cord reflex. So it's going to go in very quickly to the spinal cord. It's going to come out and it's going to create more stiffness or less stiffness based on the load or the stretch of those tissues. And that's how the body works throughout the whole body. The muscle spindle fibers give us information. It's just interesting that the multifidi around the low back, if we go to the next slide, I think we'll see, if we see So here we see some of the multifidi fibers and the interosseous fibers. I said they were rotatory, but in essence, they're small and they're local, and these muscles are going to create a stiffness, or they're going to create some resistance to the load. And in this case, it could be a flexion load, it could be a side bending load, it could be a rotatory load that it's going to have that stretch reflex. And if we go back to the previous slide, we'll see that the vertical fibers would become stiffened to be able to maintain the appropriate stiffness for the task. So this is all happening automatically. It's happening in milliseconds. It is usually not having any volitional overload on it. They're just things that we learn, especially with tasks that we are already familiar with. Let's move forward to the abdominal slides. So here we look at the oblique muscles. We see external obliques on the left side of your screen and the internal obliques on the right side of your screen. And these are layers of muscles also that are known to be both global and locals. We'll talk about that in a second. Global meaning they accelerate motion or decelerate motion. So as they contract, they're going to facilitate a rotation of the trunk between the rib cage and the pelvis, or they're going to slow it down. Think of something like a golf swing, and we go into the backswing. And as we're going into the backswing, certain fibers here of the obliques and other muscles are being lengthened, being stretched, and they're slowing down the backswing. And then when they accelerate, they are contracting concentrically to be able to speed the body up through that motion. And as you cross midline, then it's going to do the opposite with the antagonist muscles to slow it back down. So these are very interesting muscles that provide both the local muscle stability and control, and they also provide the global muscle acceleration, deceleration, depending on the activity and depending on the load. Very important to understand that muscles can have diverse purposes. Sometimes people think, oh, external oblique always causes a rotation to the opposite side. That's a concentric contraction. It is a global muscle. But that is not true. It also provides an eccentric contraction in the opposite direction. And with the transverse abdominis, it's going to create a stiffening when we need to have greater stability and greater intra-abdominal pressure for heavier vertical loads like powerlifting. And I hope I'm not going through these too fast, but I just want to touch on them so you have these visual images in your head as Shelly and I talk about them and cueing. How do we get these muscles to behave or to work? So if we look at the left side of the screen, what we see is the iliacus on the left of it, and it's also tied in here into the iliac crest, and it comes down, attaches into the inner thigh. So it is a hip flexor, and it also can create a little bit of an internal rotation moment arm when the leg is flexed. So a lot of dancers would be using this muscle, for example, in passe développé if you're a dancer. The muscle next to it inserts in the same insertion, and this is our psoas major and minor. And the psoas major and minor not only cover the hip flexion component, but come up high into the spine. That's why I showed you where the psoas major in particular passes through the diaphragm and attaches into T12 transverse process and body. So that's really important. If the hip flexors are really shortened, what happens, Shelly? If they're short and you stand up and you want to walk, it's going to create what kind of force on your low back?
Oh, it's going to pull you into extension. I got nervous there. I couldn't find my mute button. As many times as I've been on Zoom. Yeah, it's gonna pull you forward out of that lengthened position into spine extension or more hip flexion.
And in addition to that, the shear force. So not only does it put you into extension, but when we're in extension and let's say we're running and our hip flexors are restricted, we're going to have repeated shear force, which is why we have such a high incidence of degenerative joint disease at L4, L5, L5S1. You know, we become a sedentary population that we've talked about a lot of times on the show. And therefore, we have a lot of degenerative L4, L5 kind of problems because of that relationship. If we look over onto the right side of the screen, what we're looking at here is the quadratus lumborum. So the quadratus lumborum is going to come from the iliac crest and come up and insert into the transverse processes of the lumbar spine. So it also creates a lateral flexion. It can create some deceleration movement. The medial fibers of the psoas major are thought to be local deep muscles that stabilize because they're literally connecting vertebra to vertebra and not necessarily down into the hip. However, if you are keen on fascia, you realize that even though those short fibers are connecting just to the vertebra, the body of the psoas major still lies next to it, and the neurological innervation is the same. So there is a relationship. You're not going to be able to isolate just the local fibers of the iliopsoas. So that's really important. That's just a little summary of muscles that are involved and trigger. The hip flexor is a big trigger, as well as the quadratus of load. So when they get stretched, they are also muscles that are going to send messages into the spinal cord, and they're going to create more multifidi stiffness, more global stiffness as well, based on the load. So somebody asked a question, I think, Shelly, about cueing for things like powerlifting. And I think when you look at powerlifting and we're doing something like a deadlift or a clean and jerk, we really don't want to have a lot of play in this part of the spine here, right? We don't want to have a lot of shear force. We don't want to have the hip flexors pulling on that spine forward when we're trying to load the vertebra vertically with a clean and jerk lift. We want to have that stability. So the greater the load, the less movement, the greater the stiffness. And that's a natural response the body's going to do. You don't have to tell somebody, brace. All you got to do is put the load on them, and you'll watch their system learn how to brace. Now, there are novices that are learning how to lift load that are the dangerous sort of zone because they need to learn to anticipate that load and to have the proper intra-abdominal pressure. If you haven't had the experience before, then your anticipation is incorrect. And the finer that our anticipation ties into the actual load, the more efficient we are with moving that load or sustaining that load. And I think that's a real key take home. We'll come back to it a little bit more with some of your questions. Let's finish up with an integrated look at the abdominal wall. This next one, we're looking at the, where we're sort of seeing everything on it, right? So we're seeing some lats and serratus, and we're seeing the pec major up on top. We see the rectus abdominis. We peel it away a little bit here on the left. We can see some of the transverse abdominis deep, as if it was peeled away. We can see the obliques and internal obliques down low. And we get an idea of how it's just this incredible masterpiece. I think sort of like this art piece from Kelly Anderson. It's so beautiful when we think of all the different fibers and contractile directions that are laid on top of our skeleton that also moves. So every time that I change the moment arm or the relationship of a joint in the spine, it has to adjust neuromuscularly and fascially to that load. Some of the tone and resistance is fascial elasticity. Some of it is underlying tone that is in the muscles naturally in a healthy body. And what we want to be careful of doing is over-recruiting or over-cueing something that is now getting in the way of a very natural adaptation system in our body to movement. Movement is the thing that sort of changes things. And this is, I'll finish up with this, and I'd like to hear some thoughts from Shelly on sort of this idea of what comes to her mind as she looks at this picture in cueing core control and cueing intra-abdominal pressured activity. When I think of this idea of load response and how we're so blessed in the Pilates community to have the ability to modify and manipulate load, and we can lay that on top of movement. So Richardson and Hodges' study was done in a static position. Why? Because we can't do needle EMG in moving parts of the body. So the report that we have from there, which is a fantastic study back in '96, it still holds water, is that the muscle relationships was based on a statically neutral spine with a moving arm. The shoulder was going into flexion, abduction, and extension. So what would happen if the spine was in 10 degrees of flexion or a rotation or a combined movement like a golf swing? How would that change this neuromuscular response to load? And I don't think we have the scientific data because we can't stick needles in people while they're moving, but we can certainly extrapolate. And this is where I'd like to go and sort of hear even creatively what Shelly is as a master Pilates teacher, how she sees a picture like this. What does it make you think of as far as trying to cue core control with isolated muscle contraction?
It makes me crazy because I just can't do it anymore. I mean, I really, I just can't go that way. And so many questions. I was looking over to, again, kind of scroll through some of the questions that were asked. And there were a lot of questions based around, well, if you don't cue navel to spine, or if you're no longer saying scoop or hollow or any of the variety of different cues there are for, we've heard over the years, well, what's a good cue then? So what is a good cue? And it seems to me it's a little bit backwards. I don't know what a good cue is because I don't know what you want out of the movement. A good cue for doing a side plank moving into star in terms of, from the shoulders to the pelvis is going to be a very different good cue than a rollover or corkscrew or something where there's mobility. So I think we need to change our thinking a little bit to think what is, and Brent, you hear Brent talk about this all the time. What is the desired outcome? What do you want out of this movement? Do you want more mobility? Do you want less mobility? Do you want more control? What do you want? And then you can create a scenario. And I go back to imagery because it tends to be a little bit more of a system, like a full body and mind cue than, just again, a muscle cue. But sometimes we do like to cue the skeleton in terms of alignment and relationships of parts to other parts. So I would say, know what you want, even if you're not quite, you don't get it right the first time. Hardly any of us are right the first time, but what do you want? And what type of information can you give somebody to get them closer to being able to do that? And then the next part that I think is so important, and I've been trying to incorporate this more and more into my own classes that I'm teaching and when I'm teaching the education courses, is, again, this idea of how do I give the information to someone so that they can, with my help, be successful, whatever that means, and then my help goes away over time, and their internal awareness is heightened over time. So, they have to have better proprioception, better awareness of where their body is in space. Should it be moving more? Should it be moving less? All of these things. So those are kind of some of the things that I think of as far as, what are the good cues? Because there were so many questions about that. Is figure out what you want. Look at the body in front of you, and then give that person information to move them closer to being able to do the activity that you want.
Yeah. And, that just leads to the next idea of global versus isolated, right? And any of these muscles in and of themselves trying to isolate are not going to create the objective of core control. So I think the first thing we have to do is we have to remove the idea that core control is the same thing as really tight rectus abdominis and oblique muscles. A lot of people, the picture we used in the advertisement is a good example of what people think of. Oh, good core control exercise. We're going to have ripped abs and ripped obliques.
Right. And somebody actually asked that. They asked the question about how do I know, that I'm strong enough, and is aesthetics a way to measure that? And I would say absolutely not. And you have people who are very muscular and cut and ripped and all of these things, and they are functionally quite weak because they can't do certain tasks. Maybe they can do other tasks really well. And this again goes back to participation. What does the client want to do? If you're training them to run, that's very different than training them to do capoeira, the Brazilian, flowing martial art. So again, we have to, as teachers, stop looking for the recipe of, oh, I say this now. You have to look much bigger than that to know what is the activity, what are the things that are necessary to really efficiently do that activity. If you want to have ripped abs and go to the beach and have that, and that to you is aesthetically pleasing, go for it. Do a zillion sit-ups and crunches and all those things, because that's how you're going to get that.
Well, we both have ripped abs. They're just underneath about a half an inch of adipose tissue.
A little bit, yeah. So I think, my challenge to, to everybody out there is stop relying on the things that we've always said. The idea may still be really good, some of the ideas, but we've got to explain it in a way that goes to the system. And we need to know more about what the clients want to do. And it's not just enough to know what's going on in an exercise. I can teach somebody how to do short spine, but how does that relate to them going out to play golf? It may not, but I need to make sure I'm incorporating all of those things that gets them back to being able to be functional. And the way if you are strong enough, right, is you're looking at what the torso needs to do in these activities. And we can even go farther. I remember, Cynthia McGee used to say, identify on your own self. Just think about, where do your legs start? Where do your arms start, right? It's not just at the shoulder, right here. How much musculature from the back muscles up to the arm, to the shoulder blade, from the thigh muscles up to the buttocks and into the body? The core really is the whole thing. So what are the positions you need to be in? Do you need to sustain them for a long period of time? Can you? Or do you need to move quickly? If you're a boxer, that's very different than, doing something else. So I think we need to challenge ourselves to go beyond just saying the same old stuff all the time.
Yeah. And, when we look at the difference between cueing successful movement and successful task versus the muscle torque or the definition that we often have in the fitness and the rehab world, is where I think we have the biggest sort of chasm between what are we teaching and, hey, I just learned about all these muscles. I think it's Sarah makes a comment in the chat or in the Q&A about the idea of, look, our clients are an anatomist. We're not trying to teach them. I mean, I do teach them anatomy, but I teach them anatomy usually from the standpoint of movement anatomy, of how things work for them based on their pathology or their performance. At that same time, what we want them to know is, what does it feel like to have appropriate intra-abdominal pressure for this activity? And that's a hard thing to do. And you're not going to do it with isolated muscle contraction. So, we might identify that somebody has a deficiency. There's another question, a great question by Christine in here talking about fascial disruption. So a lot of times somebody has a C-section, or they have a diastase, or they have a major abdominal surgery, or they had back surgery, something that disrupted the natural muscle layering and myofascial tissue, and it results in scar tissue. And there is research that shows that scar tissue in these areas, for example, if I have a cut through the layer, and by the way, what we're looking at here is a horizontal slice of the abdominal wall by Netter. I love this picture because it gives a good idea of how the fascia comes across and wraps around and envelops the vertical fibers of the rectus abdominis. So here you have the external oblique on the left and external fascial fibers that make up the rectus abdominal sheath. You have the inguinal oblique that splits, and half of it goes in front and half of it goes behind, and the transverse abdominis that goes behind. Well, the purpose of this, again, is when there's a stretch reflex going on, or a demand or an anticipated load, what's going to happen is the fascial tissues will become taut around the erector spinae hypertrophy into it, and we create intra-abdominal pressure. That's the whole idea. We create a pressure that is circumferential. So if somebody has a diastasis right here, which is where the fascia between the rectus spinae, the rectus abdominis is separated, or maybe they had a C-section and a horizontal cut across the fascia, or another abdominal surgery, that scar tissue can impair this natural sliding and tension creating relationship inside of the natural fascial anatomy. And so the next part of that question is, how would you cue clients? Well, I would cue clients the same way. I'd want to sort of create the demand on that tissue. Fascia is very dynamic. If you ever get a chance to look at strolling under the skin, or look at some of the latest fascial research that's just coming out in droves these days in the literature. Italy is a big player. UK and Scotland, big players in the research coming out on fascia. But it's very dynamic. And one of the images I read in a paper recently was that fascia could be compared to a three-dimensional printer. And it's just continuing to print down or lay down based on the demand or the position of the tissue. So for us, we want to keep creating that normal relationship of load and intra-abdominal pressure and elasticity. If it's too bad, it might require things like some myofascial release intervention. And in some really severe cases, it might even require some surgical release, or deep needling is another good option, or acupuncture is another good option for those. So again, just looking at the anatomy here and sort of thinking of, it is so well designed that if my spine, which is back in this area, decides that it needs to flex or rotate, all of these tissues have to adapt to that rotation to be in a position where it's ready to fire. We call that alpha gamma coactivation, where this muscle spindle fibers are always creating an underlying tone. No matter what position my body moves in, it's making my muscles ready to work. So when the anticipated load comes, they can do their job of stiffening and increasing intra-abdominal pressure. And that's just, to me, that's just a miracle. It's a beautiful, well-designed machine. And when we try to do isolated muscle contraction, I think we're trying to interfere with the design of the machine. There's much better systemic and systematized ways of cueing core control that we want to spend the rest of the time talking about. So when we look at muscle types, we can break them pretty simply into the deep local muscles, and also we can talk about the superficial global muscles. But the reality is that, depending on the function, the range of motion, the movement position, the compensation, a lot of times the muscles can be doing multiple things depending on what it's being asked to do by that activity. So the activity becomes more demanding on how that muscle is going to function. Like I explained, the oblique internus and externus. Depending on the activity, it could be either a deep local or a superficial global. The psoas major, depending on the activity, it could be either one of these, depending on what portion of the fibers and what the activity is that we're talking about. So when we look at deep local muscles, we often refer to them as the stiffening muscles. They're the muscles that are going to create a little bit of stiffness based on the anticipated load. I do an exercise always where most of you are familiar with bent knee openings, right? So I start off with the very slow bent knee opening, bring it back up, really learn how to keep the pelvis quiet. Oh, we master that. But what is that good for, right? Well, it provides rotostability. It teaches rotostability. But for what? When you move that slow, how does that relate to normal movement? And so what I like to do is I start playing with tempo. Whereas I speed up the tempo, what happens to the range of motion and the stiffness? Well, the range of motion gets shorter, right? And the trunk has to get stiffer because the load is increasing, the stretch is increasing, and the spinal cord automatically, if it knows what the task is for the pelvis to stay quiet and the legs to move faster, the torso gets stiffer. That's going to happen in these muscles over here. They're going to get stiffer. Deep local muscles, multifidi, transverse abdominis, pelvic floor, anything that's going to relate to the intra-abdominal pressure. And the accelerators are going to work harder and decelerators work harder to be able to manage the movement of that internal external rotation of bent knees, opening and closing. So it depends, again, on the activity. Think of rotator cuff. Rotator cuff's job, first and foremost, is to approximate the head of the humerus into the fossa and then create a little more stiffening to depress it so that the bigger muscles, things like the deltoids and pecs and lats, can do their job accelerating or decelerating the arm in its relationship to the scapula and to the torso. So it has that relationship. But if I'm throwing a ball, it is possible that my rotator cuff is going to be acting as an accelerator and a decelerator of the rotational moment. So there you have another muscle group that has both acting as deep and local stabilizer, deep local stabilizer, as well as superficial and global. So what I try to encourage people to is to go through yourself and just start thinking of looking at the anatomy, thinking of the movement, looking at other forces. This was one that Shelly and I were talking about. Maybe you can share a little bit about as well. It's not always a muscle that's initiating a movement or the primary movement force. There are other forces out there that move us.
Yeah, we were just talking about this in the studio the other day, and somebody was asking about, would a standing roll down be a good flexion exercise for somebody that had a bit of a diastasis, because this person needed to be able to move into flexion, but couldn't yet do it well, supporting either the weight of the head and trying to even just lift the head or nod the head or lift the legs. They didn't have the capacity yet to have the control, and they didn't have the awareness. Could she start with a standing roll down? And I said, yeah, that's great. I said, because what is we're trying to not put so much load on the abdominal wall. So what's the prime mover? And this whole room of people were standing around listing muscles. And I said, guys, it's gravity, yes. I mean, and here's where, like the decelerators are really important. So the spine extensors, getting into the buttocks muscles, the hamstrings, they're going to keep you from falling on your head. So also just in cueing, think, we don't want to do the single muscle cueing, but also we don't want to do single muscle cueing when it's not even the right time for those muscles to work. So I think we've gone a little beyond that, and I'm really glad that you brought up the tempo piece, Brent, because a couple of people, I was just again kind of glancing through the questions, and a few people have talked about, I've given as many cues as I can give, good, full body cues. Cues for self-tactile and awareness, where the client's hands are on the body, my hands on their body, explaining how the abdominal all works. And a lot of these had to do with either diastasis or just a little bit of a bracing and pushing of the abdominal wall out to get, some stability, which it does give you. It's not the best, but it will help stabilize a little bit. We can do it in a more efficient way. And tempo and load and those ways that we manipulate stuff, I think sometimes we don't give enough stimulus to clients. I mean, you guys have done this where you're having somebody do, femur arcs and things, which I hardly even do anymore because I feel like we've got so many other things. But if you gave them some femur arcs and they weren't really able to control their body very well, and they couldn't feel that their body was moving, you can put them on top of an OOV, you can put them on a foam roller, and all of a sudden, the relationship to gravity and the ground and the lack of support of the mat and the floor holding the body up, all of a sudden they do one or two and they're completely off balance and their nervous system goes, whoa, let's bring this back together. So there was an appropriate amount of load or stimulus to the nervous system that created a change in how they were doing. It's kind of self-preservation. You don't want to fall off. So you figure out how to do it. And those are the things that are so magical about all of the unstable and compliant surfaces we have. We need to eventually get them back to the surfaces they're going to be on. So we want to bring it back to function. But in terms of a tool for heightening somebody's awareness, if they can't do it while they're doing footwork and feet and straps and all these things that are in a pretty easy position to be in, there's not a lot of stimulus to the body, is think about how you can change that a little bit, add tempo. We've been working with some kids here on the farm, and we were talking about doing push-ups and planks, and they were like, oh, plank's easy. And we held for 30 seconds and they looked pretty good. Not too bad. And I said, all right, great. Put your feet all the way together in your plank. And now we went to some of the Runity work, right? So hand to chest and try to get that. And they were all over the place. And it was like, okay, so now see how you can get this back. And they get it. So sometimes we actually have to do more in a safe way, but do more so the information coming into the system is enough to really stimulate the system to make those changes. So that was some of the questions that were, it's like, what do I do? It's just keep looking for that stimulus that is going to make the difference to that person, and everybody responds differently. So you just don't know what's going to work.
Yeah. This was just a picture by Norris that he drew, 2 decades ago, sort of demonstrating the idea of the hydraulic amplifier. And this is looking at the relationship of the transverse abdominis, the multifidi, as well as the diaphragm and the pelvic floor. And the one thing that I always like to show that is if you can think of it as being circumferential and a top and a bottom, it's like a piston. It is the intra-abdominal pressure that sort of determines the preparedness of the body for load. And, typically we're talking about vertical or axial load in the human being. So for example, if we're doing things on the ground that we often do, like 100 doesn't really, as loaded as it is with the legs being up against gravity and we feel it working and the hip flexors are pulling our back off, it's not a normal intra-abdominal pressure, because normal intra-abdominal pressure is more related to human-esque movement of being vertical with gravity. We're bipedal animals. And so there's a lot more discussion in that area that we can maybe address another day, of working with bipedal animals versus quadruped animals. This is also a thing coming from Comerford, and prior to Comerford was Punjabi, was looking at neutral zone. So we look at spinal stability concepts. As the load increases, the amount of range is going to decrease. That's what we were talking about, for example, with the bent knee openings. So just giving you an idea is the key is not to keep the range of motion the same when the load's increasing. And this is where it's a simple rule. There were a number of questions talking about, well, how do we cue core control when somebody's powerlifting or versus somebody that might be swimming or somebody that's swinging a golf club? And what we're really looking at here is, as the load increases, the neutral zone decreases. That also means that range of motion decreases in our spine. We don't want a lot of spine mobility. We want to be able to minimize that, increase the stiffness. And at the same time, somebody with the purpose of doing this could theoretically train to push the range of motion open wider and wider with a higher load. That's just a trained behavior. So if I had to throw a hammer for track and field, now I'm, instead of being super stiff, I'm going to have a little bit of rotation to be able to get the desired acceleration on that hammer. So my training is going to push that neutral zone out with that same load. And the same thing is if I'm going to be golfing, I want a wider range of motion. I want more mobility, but because the golf club is fairly light, I don't have to worry about that. I can have a larger neutral zone that I can move that spine, have the appropriate stiffness, and be safe. And this is where that unique approach for each individual based on what they choose to participate in and what activities they choose to do. And then we have to be educated enough to be able to look at that. On this part, like facilitating stability of the torso, we often use this term. This was sort of a Confucius term, as much as necessary, as little as possible, that was derived in one of my mentors, Alan Lee. Funny if I was just talking about him with Rob Lowe yesterday, Shelly, down at USC. But it was the appropriate amount of stiffness for the anticipated load. So this is a loaded quote, right? This is saying the stiffness is the intra-abdominal pressure of the torso. How much? The appropriate amount. How much is the appropriate amount? Well, it depends on what the load is. The load could be tempo, it could be range, it could be gravity, it could be external weights. All of those things, endurance, all of those things can be load. So how much stiffness do I need? I need the appropriate amount for what I'm expecting to be able to do. What about if it's a new activity? Well, if it's a new activity, I don't have anticipation. So it's novel. And typically in novel movement, I'm going to over-recruit as a neuromuscular motor learning strategy. And I'm going to use a co-contraction philosophy or strategy to be able to do that, which means I'm going to over-recruit. We talk about this as the bandhas inside of the joints in yoga, that we're going to over-recruit these muscles on both sides of the joint to make sure that we're protecting the joints in this movement. That's a normal human strategy. So we don't want to beat our clients up when they go into a novel strategy for a novel movement because they don't have anticipation capacity. They've never had the experience. And so this is something that you spend a lot of time with, Shelly, I know, and have taught all over the world, is how do we start educating them on what the anticipated load is for the activity, so then they can recruit the appropriate amount of stiffness that's needed for that. And that is the definition to me of neuromuscular stability. Any thoughts on that before we go on?
Well, just that it really is, you have to look at, also our languaging, how we as teachers are talking about it. If I go in and say something about you're going to move your body in this way and you do it, okay. Or, well, this is a really hard exercise. This takes lots of whatever it takes, and so again, it goes back to, we really need to listen to what we're saying. I encourage everybody, I do it myself, is listen to what you're saying when you teach. Record yourself, set your phone up and record yourself teaching, and then listen to what you say. And is it really informative? Or are you biasing somebody's, their experience before they've even had it? So however you describe the motion, if they've never done it before, that's how they are now biased in that way. So as much as we can have neutral language, right? So we're just telling them about the movement, and then see what they do, and then give them the information. And you're doing it right when all those things are in line. You have pretty good alignment, you accomplish the task, nothing hurts, like in that way. Then you've done it enough. You don't have to do more than that.
Yeah. And again, that was Joseph Pilates' whole philosophy too, was daily practice of contrology. There was a question that came up: how often should we be focused on core control exercises? And it's like, well, It's not that we're focusing on core control exercises. It's that we're focusing on control of movements. We're improving our movement quality. And to me, one of the great tools that we have to manipulate is load. So you've heard me talk a lot about load, and over the past couple of years of, our environment as Pilates teacher, and we can be as physical therapists. It is in the gyrotonic tower and some of the apparatus and gyrotonic methodology. There's lots of other different techniques now that are using this etiology of load manipulation. Peter O'Sullivan was one of the first to do research on it out of Australia a couple decades ago, looking at graded load activities. And if you think of how children learn how to move, it is graded load. They go from scooting to crawling to walking to running to jumping to lifting. And we have this graded load process over a period of a couple of years that we learn how to be human beings and how to interact with our environment. So the question that often comes to us, and I can look and say that probably 20% of the questions on this thing that came in and that we built this whole webinar around are asking, how much and when and how often. And I'm going to make it a really simple answer, and then I'll let you maybe share what your thoughts are on this, Shelly. But I love to go back to the ICF model. And, that's International Classification of Function and Abilities. And so the first question, you all have heard me say this in the case studies, what do you believe you should be able to participate in? Oh, I believe I should be able to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. Well, what activities and what strengths and endurances and ranges of motion are needed to be able to climb Mount Kilimanjaro? As the practitioner, I need to know what that is, what that demand is, or I need to find somebody who knows. I can't know every single activity demand, although I spend a lot of time, trying to map them out. But somebody does in that sport. Somebody does with that pathology. And so we go and we seek understanding of what is the expected performance of the neuromuscular system, the skeletal system, the endurance system, the respiratory system, the cardiovascular, whatever the system is that is deficient in that person's ability to perform what they believe they should be able to perform. And then I create a program around that. Where are you today? This is where you are. This is where you need to be. This gap, we often joke about the subway system in the UK, mind the gap. That's where our attention is as good practitioners, is minding the gap. If I can create enough load to create the tissue adaptation or the function adaptation to participate, or I can create the shift in the belief of being able to participate through positive movement experiences, then we've achieved our job. And so it's going to be different for every person. There's not a magical number that says, all right, we're going to do a 20% increase in load once a week on your core muscles based on your choice, right? That never works. What we can do is we can show through tests that we do that they have successfully shown that they can do a full squat, that they have successfully shown that they have the mobility in their thoracic spine to move in all planes. They can successfully demonstrate, and that's why we use the Pulsar assessment tool, is to see what are measurable landmarks that we can use to show that they're ready to participate in these activities. And that's what Shelly and I have been working on, is identifying which tests go with which activities. And then we can look at it. And then the Pilates world is the graded load mecca. So you all know how to use the Pilates. How do we grade load? Springs, change of orientation, length of lever, the list goes on and on that we challenge these things on. Let's go to the next slide. And Shelly, while we're going to the next slide, just things that come to your mind now as we talk about this transition from isolated movement muscle cueing that we've been huge advocates of getting away from for at least 20 years into systems cueing, looking at all of the systems.
Right. And my short answer, you had a very long answer with the ICF model and all of that. I had a very short answer, which is my answer to everything is it depends. So it depends on the person, depends on the activity, it
That's the
depends,
Libra.
right? I don't
That's
know.
the Libra in you.
It is because I don't know. So when I think of this, sometimes I even move away from the cueing part. And I remember Angela Crowley, my and your gyrotonic teacher, my good friend. She used to talk about, and I think this comes both from her gyrotonic training, but especially probably from her Feldenkrais training, is she would say, give the client the movement. Just if you could take their body through the movement, whatever it is, figure out how you can do that on the apparatus. Give them the movement. They don't have to think about it. They don't have to follow your directions. You don't have to do any of those things. Just give them the movement and let them absorb it and start to figure it out. Sometimes you don't really have to cue anything. So I also, new teachers, we've talked about this recently, want to cue everything. If the client is already doing whatever, and yes, Penny, I just saw Penny's chat come up and said, give people permission to move. Absolutely. Let them move and let them figure it out. And a lot of times you can just go right on to the next thing, acknowledge that they did this well, and then move on to something else and keep challenging them a little bit. So sometimes you don't have to cue anything, but when you do, give them a full body experience as much as possible. Bring the alignment into it. Don't get too caught up. I really appreciated Juan's comment a few webinars ago where he was like, this precise alignment is not going to be so great. Just get it pretty good and let people move. So that's
we certainly have appreciated that working with the kids.
Oh my gosh,
last
yeah.
couple of weeks.
They're great. So anyway, I know I'll cut my comments a little short. I know we're getting short on time, but that's, just to stop telling people what to do and let them do it. And then if something needs tweaking, tweak it a little bit.
Yeah. And ask them what they're observing as they're tweaking, right? Mm-hmm. Give them enough repetitions that they can make their own corrections looking for efficiency. Mm-hmm. Challenging things teaching a course yesterday down at USC, and we were trying to get the students to, move with as little energy as possible to be able to do some of the exercises. How can you get out of your way of the novelty co-contraction idea? So the idea was, it was a new movement for them, and explaining with the understanding they're going to have a novel strategy, and then giving them another strategy layer on top of that is, your goal with this exercise is to use as little muscle as possible. So as you're going through doing enough repetitions to where you can start going, oh, I don't need jaw tension. I don't need to over-recruit squeezing my glutes. That didn't seem to do anything for me. I also noticed I was curling my toes and my fingers. So having them go through and answer that question of what were you over-recruiting in this new movement? And it's like, okay, so let's do it again, and let's just leave those things out of it because you identified them already. I didn't tell them to stop squeezing their hands or quit clenching their jaw. Matter of fact, I didn't even see that in them. But the fact that they felt it and observed it with the command to let go of unnecessary muscle guarding, muscle tension, muscle recruitment for that movement was a powerful tool for them.
I do want to put out really quick. I know we're getting way over on time.
It's okay. We go over a little these days.
I just want to put out there with the ideas of, navel to spine and all these things that we've talked about, and how can we maybe get the desired result that we think we're after with that, but in a better way. I'll throw it out there to really evaluate how often in a class do you teach heels together, squeeze your heels together, draw your inner thighs together, zip up your inner thighs. Someone in the question, it was a little tongue-in-cheek, which I love, said, can we please stop moving away from lift the abdominals in and up? She says, what does that even, or he, I don't know if it was a man or a woman, what does that even mean? So when you're listening to yourself teaching, go back to some of these cues that you may say over and over and identify, is it actually making a difference? Is it, it's like cueing, again, moving away from abdominal cueing and this isolated cueing, but even wronger is cueing the abdominal wall during something that moves into extension, because 3 of the 4 muscles will move you toward flexion. So also just think about the appropriateness there. Are you cueing a muscle group that's actually contrary to the movement that you want to have? If you're cueing flexors and you're trying to move into extension, that's even worse. So really listen. I mean, that's probably my take home, is really listen to what you're saying and maybe make some changes and see how you can evolve your own teaching.
Yeah, there's another question that had come in that was talking just about that. It said, on all the courses I've attended, there's no awareness on how to start to train a highly conditioned person who has incompetent core. So the idea is, just because somebody has really strong rectus abdominis and obliques doesn't mean that they have a stable core, right? As a matter of fact, when we're looking now at pelvic incontinence, I'm not going to get off on that too much, but a lot of stress incontinence is a hypertonic, pelvic floor pubococcygeus muscle. And if you think of even our bicep, if I bring my arm all the way closed here and I tighten up the bicep, this is not the most effective place for my strength, even though it might look like it's the biggest. The place that it's the strongest is out about 90 degrees flexion. And so a lot of times, we're looking at how do we help people find more effective and more efficient control of their trunk based on the activity they participate in. So there were a lot of questions about that inside the list, and hopefully we've answered a lot of those questions that we looked at that in response of what we're teaching. So we're trying to group a lot of these questions together to make that clear. And when you look at optimal, and I saw 3 or 4 questions in here on optimal core training is when we can apply the appropriate load in the dynamic alignment, meaning the movement process. So again, it doesn't mean perfect alignment. It means that we're movers, we're swinging a golf club, and what's the appropriate load that golf club plays? Well, we got to put a golf club in our hands and learn how to swing it, and gradually increase the mobility and the control of that mobility to have optimal core training, right? How much core training do they need? Enough to swing that golf club through that full range of motion with a skill set to hit that little ball and, hit it out, 200-300 yards. And again, I just wanted to reiterate here, and this is, more of my area of interest, is how do we do what I refer to as load-induced cueing. So rather than thinking we have to tell them what they're doing, we create the activity, we define the activity, and usually they can define the activity for us because it's what they want to participate in. So we go back to that ICF model. I want to participate in this. This is the activity definition. Now I can look at what necessary core control is, what's necessary for core control of that activity. And that's sort of a way that I've been evolving the way that I think in my cueing, is I still want to get a nice strong core as it's appropriate to the activity that the client wants to participate in. So I think that, again, we were able to tackle a lot of these questions. There's more that are left unanswered still. We have a lot of work to do. Hopefully the new book coming out in the new year, it's backed up because of paper. So we apparently have a 3-month delay because of paper shortages. I guess we're feeling the effects of COVID everywhere still. But that book is designed, Principles of Movement. Shelly has helped me out a tremendous amount with the editing of that book and just continue to work through the concepts and the philosophies of it over the last 20, 30 years. And we hope that it'll be a big asset in people's understanding of movement. And a big part of that is control. And so we have made changes. If you've been a Polestar follower, and we used to talk about core control, we shifted that word to control with the idea that your hips and your knees and your ankles and your big toes and your nose needs control too. So if we understand control and we understand load, we have a huge advantage in re-educating proper movement. And if we can tie it into the critical reasoning piece that Shelly and I both talked about today, of assessing what are their needs, what do they believe they need, what are the activities they want to participate in, then we identify where they're at in relationship to that, and we can cue them to have the proper core control and strength and power and mobility to be able to have a successful experience. Shelly, any last minute thing you want to share? Maybe, I mean, I know you and I both have some pet peeves and things like that, or things that we always like to share regarding core control.
Well,
But any last
well,
thing
I was saying, just even in the bigger picture, is keep your desire. You know, one of the first things we want to do is teach people how to move better, whatever the thing is that they're doing, whether it's a sport and activity, it's a Pilates exercise, it's yoga, it's gyrotonic, whatever it is, help them understand it and do it better. That's really, and you know, that's kind of our golden rule of, you know, why we're doing this. And then don't let yourself or the client or your classes get complacent. And Brent's talked about this a lot over the last, you know, couple of years, is how can we continue to challenge people appropriately? Sometimes it's a little uncomfortable, right? Not painful, that's different, but keep challenging people. Get to that point of almost, I can almost, and then you got to stop for a moment and keep challenging, and make sure your clients understand that too, because they like to do the same 5 exercises all the time. And that's not going to create change. Sherry talked about it when we were talking about osteoporosis, novel movements, novel load, right? You have to keep upping the game, decrease the assistance, right? It's not always up, I should say, you know, just keep changing it. So really make your efforts around moving better and expand so that, you know, you're constantly challenging the nervous system, the muscular system, everything you have. That's really my mission lately. That's what I've been working on.
Well, thank you, Shelly, and thank you, everybody, for joining us. We couldn't have these wonderful webinars if it wasn't for your questions. And so we want you to continue sending questions. We'll continue to bring on some interesting guests and different topics. We can be assured that we are putting our efforts into bringing knowledge to you. Thank you for all you do. We have a number of courses all around the world that are available to you, some online, some in person. Sometimes repeating some of the core training has evolved a lot. If it's been a number of years since you've been through training, come join us at the farm in North Carolina. Shelly's going to be conducting an intensive transition. We also are going to be starting to offer some transitions that are split up over a couple weekends. So keep your eyes open in 2023. I know a lot of times it takes some long-term planning to do things now. So we are loving doing live courses again. We will continue to do virtual ones, but it is so good to be in person. We love you. We appreciate you. Please be safe. Be kind, and we'll see you next Thursday at the next Polestar Pilates Hour. Thanks, Shelly.
Bye. Thanks, Brent.